So what we're going to talk about now are seam finishes. Not everyone has a serger at home, and not all projects really are conducive to a serger. So I just want to show you a couple methods that you can use other than a serger. So what I've done is I've just done some little sample seams here. These are always a great idea. If you're not sure about how to do something, use your scrap and make a little seam and test it out. So what I've done is just done my little scrap here. So the first method that you can do is to just serge it, if you have that available, or the other option is to run a seam on top of your seam. You're not stitching them together, you are just running a straight line stitch, and you want to do that just about 1/4 of an inch. Sometimes a little less, but we're just going to do it at 1/4 on this one. And just run that down your side here. Now, if you're using a modern machine, which obviously you can tell I'm not, if I was, you could also do a zigzag stitch very close to your edge. And that would be fine as well. That's something that you could do to secure it. However, the older machine that I'm using doesn't give you an option for a zigzag. You have to actually create your own zigzag. So since we're working with vintage patterns, I'm really showing you more techniques that were available for vintage things. And these are still useful to use for any modern, and some fabrics just work better with them. So being that this particular kinds of suiting, as you can tell, it frays a lot, what I've done is I've just run that straight stitch. Now, I am going to do it on the other side as well, because on each one I'm going to show you a different technique. Only one of the techniques requires something other than your needle and thread that I'm going to show you. For some things like binding, you can bind your edges as well if you have a seam graves, or if you might want to bind using a contrasting lightweight fabric. However, that would be an additional cost, something that you may not be able to do. The first thing that I'm going to show you would be with pinking shears. So I happen to love pinking shears. I know a lot of people feel that they're outdated and not useful. I find them very useful for things, partly because I do a lot of reenactments, and so this is something that's very appropriate. If you're looking at doing something that would be a period correct kind of a costume or anything, pinking shears have been around for hundreds of years. They just used to be created differently. Actually, in the 1700s, they were a piece that you put down and hammered it across, and it did the same kind of zigzag cut. So if you're not familiar with it, that's what this does here. It just does this little zigzag of a cut. Works like any other scissors. The downside is that they can be kind of heavy. So you've run your seam, and now you're just going to very closely to that stitch pink along it. This is one option of something you can do. Now, you can also do this stitch line by hand if you're not comfortable running your full garment along your sewing machine again, or if you forget and you're like, I really need to do a seam finish after all. Sometimes you're not really sure, and that's fine. So that's something you can do as well. So for this one, what we've done on this one side is you have your straight stitch and then your pinking. So the other option of what you can do would be a hand overcast. Now, a hand overcast basically is creating the serger technique by hand. And what I'm going to do is show you that with a contrasting thread. I'm going to use a white here just so you can see it a little easier. And you're going to, just like you would, get your arm width. And to do that, you're going to come up from the back side, bring it over. Now, you want to do this pretty close to your stitch line or right inside of it so that that really secures it. And then you're just going to, like it sounds, overcast it, bring it over your seam. However, you will be bringing your thread through so that it creates kind of a little bar tack. And you'll do that just all the way down. So if you can see here, you're going to just very simply do it in this nature. You're going to bring this back over. Bring your thread back through it so that it creates a bar. And this is a hand overcast. And this is another way of finishing a seam. Now, if you're not sure about it, if you want to make sure your stitches are completely perfect, you can do this all the way down it. You can do it all the way down your practice seam. I'm not going to bore you and do that. So what you can see here, this is a hand overcast, and it covers that seam. And it makes it so that's not going to fray. You can do them fairly close together. You can do them further apart. So another option is going to be, again, they pretty much all start out the same. You're going to stitch fairly close. Again, 1/4 inch is a good space within your seam allowance to go ahead and stitch that. Now this next technique we're going to stitch and then we're going to turn over. Now what you would do in between these is you would stitch and then take it to your iron and iron these flat. I'm just going to finger press them so that you can see how they're done. So again, you have that seam. Now, what you would do here is then fold this over and press that down. I'm just going to use a few pins to show you this. And this is where you would then use that hand stitching technique that I talked about for the waistband. And do the same thing. You just want to pick up one little thread of it and go all the way down in the same fashion. But by having that stitched seam in there, you're keeping your threads from coming unraveled within your fold. However, if you do just fold without a stitch here, what happens when you wash and wear is that eventually these will start to peek out. But by having that seam, your stitch line along here, it keeps it from unraveling. So you'll just, same fashion, use your thread, and the same way that you did that hand stitching for your skirt, this waistband, it's going to be the same. Helps if you knot it. You'll find that with sewing, you use a lot of the same techniques over and over. So you'll go ahead and bring that up through your seam there. Again, you will just pick up a single thread, go a little bit down, 1/2 inch or less sometimes. You can go a full inch, it just really depends. I tend to do about 1 inch, sometimes a little less, and you will pick up your single strand of your fabric, go down, your single strand here. And again, if you had pressed this with an iron, it will keep it flat and much neater. And you always do want to press. Now, if you're just going to practice your technique and it's, you may not necessarily press. However, I recommend still following the steps and pressing. It is a great habit to get into to make sure that you always use your iron. Your iron is one of your most important tools with sewing. So again, I'm not going to bore you with showing you the whole length here, but you do in that same manner, okay, of just the stitch there. Now, if you hadn't done this by machine, you can do that stitch line by hand, and you just do a very small running stitch. If you're not familiar with a running stitch, then let me just go ahead and show you that real quick as well. Your other options, like I mentioned, are to go ahead and use a seam finish on it. A seam graves is also commonly called. So your running stitch, you're just like it sounds. You're running your needle down the length. And they're very short little stitches, especially with something like this. No back stitching with it, but again, just little running stitch. And then you can typically pink with that. So then you would just bring those pinking shears right along there and pink it. Now, if you think that your fabric isn't something that will necessarily work well with any of these techniques, another option that you can do is to iron them both to one side. Okay? Then, with this particular thing I'm going to show you, I like to pink. And you pink one side closer than the other. You just do it all the way down. And then on this other side here, we'll do our stitch line. Now, when you're working with a 5/8 seam allowance, you don't really want to make that stitch line any further away than a 1/4 inch from your raw edge, just because then you get too close to your actual seam. So this is a combination of pinking and of the flat method. What you're going to do then is to fold this over and stitch just one side down. Now, this does not work for all fabrics. This particular fabric, it would be too thick because you don't want your seams to have a very thick appearance or feel. That's great for jeans. It's not great for everything else, especially for skirts or blouses. They change the way that they flow. For this particular skirt that we're doing, I will be doing the stitching and pinking. However, I would say you could also do the overcast would be fine as well if you don't have pinking shears. That would be my next option for you. If you have a machine that does a zigzag, just like you would do this straight stitch, what you would do is a straight line stitch, and then instead of pinking, you would do a very small zigzag right along here on top of that and have a creation of an overcast. Okay? So I hope that helps you with your seam finishes and can't wait for your garments.